Wow. From close range, we official. Wow. Cocaine, money, and pistols. Wow.
It's just worldview warfare. In the previous episode, we continued our deep dive into revolutionary worldview warfare by discussing wicked deception. The spiritual heart played an important role in that episode. In this episode, the spiritual heart is going to play an important role again as we focus on the end goal of all revolutionary worldview warfare: revolution. The story of revolution is a story about love. Love is complicated and at the very same time, simple. On one hand, love is the most consequential emotion a person can feel, as well as the most consequential act a person can perform. On the other hand, how we express and receive love depends greatly on our worldview. There are basically two ways we love: selfishly and selflessly. In selfless love, we love others like we love ourselves. In other words, we love others as we love ourselves. That other may be a spouse, family member, friend, neighbor, or even the divine. Selfless love may be expressed through actions like providing services, giving gifts, spending quality time, and speaking affirming words. Selfless love, when reciprocated, promotes health on the individual level as well as the collective level. Selfish love, however, promotes destruction on the collective and individual levels because it advances self at the expense of others. This is where revolution comes in. You see, revolution exploits a specific desire. The desire for self-gratification and especially self-glorification. What makes this so insidious is that the desire for self-gratification and self-glorification is a critical vulnerability in every human who has ever lived under the shadow of the world system. On top of all that, the world system's conceptions of spiritual, mental, corporeal, or material empowerment are all ultimately dehumanizing. We could even say anti-human. So once someone takes the bait of living a life centered on self-gratification or self-glorification and then goes on to advance within the world system, they may gain the world, but they definitely lose their souls. This is because revolution is specifically designed to snuff out the light of the soul, the conscience. The conscience is the parts of our spiritual hearts whereby we exercise self-evaluation. Losing the capacity to evaluate our own actions leaves us unable, even unwilling, to evaluate if those actions are destructive to fellow humans. This extremely dangerous psycho-spiritual condition can reach the point of us coming to love destroying people, whether they have harmed us or not. Especially if that destruction provides us with financial and sensual self-gratification or intellectual and spiritual self-glorification. The capacity to self-evaluate is not lost instantaneously, however. It is lost through a subtle process that gradually occurs over time. Demoralization. For a less abstract example, listen as one of the United States' most infamous serial killers summarizes the early stages of his own demoralization process.
And I'm trying to tell you as honestly as I know how what happened. And I think this is a message I want to get across. But as a young boy, and I mean a boy of 12, 13, certainly, that I encountered outside the home again, in the local grocery store or the local drugstore, the softcore pornography, what people call softcore. But as I think I explained to you last night, Dr. Dobson, in an anecdote, that as young boys do, we explored the back roads and sideways and byways of our neighborhood, and oftentimes people would dump the garbage and whatever they were cleaning out of their house, and from time to time we'd come across pornographic books of a harder nature than more graphic, you might say, more explicit nature than we would encounter, let's say, in your local grocery store. And this also included such things as, let's say, detective magazines and more hard.
Those that involve violence.
Yes, and and this is something I think I want to emphasize is the most damaging kinds of pornography. And I'm talking from personal experience, hard, real personal experience. The most damaging kinds of pornography are those that involve violence and sexual violence. Because the wedding of those two forces, as I know only too well, brings about behavior that is just too terrible to describe.
Now, walk me through that. What was going on in your mind at that time?
Okay, before we go any further, I think it's important to me, and that people believe what I'm saying, to tell you that I'm not blaming pornography and not saying that it caused me to go out and do certain things. And I take full responsibility for whatever I've done and all the things that I've done. That's not the question here. The question and the issue is how this kind of literature contributed and helped mold and shape the kinds of violent behavior.
It fueled your fantasies, didn't it?
Well, in the beginning, it fuels this kind of thought process. Then, at a certain time, it's instrumental in what I would say crystallizing it, making it into something which is almost like a separate entity inside. And at that point, you're at the verge, or I was at the verge of acting out on these kinds of thoughts.
Now, I really want to understand that. You had gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed material, and you made or printed and video or film photos,
magazines, what have you.
And then there was the urge to take that little step or big step over to a physical event.
And it happened in stages, gradually. It doesn't necessarily, not to me at least, happen overnight. My experience with, I'd say, pornography generally, but with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality, is that once you become addicted to it, and I look at this as a kind of addiction, like other kinds of addiction, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement, until you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. You reach that jumping off point where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it will give you that which is beyond just reading about it or looking at it.
To get a deeper understanding of the demoralization process, let's take a look at the unique work of Jon Uhler.
I tend to emphasize my professional counseling background in my work with survivors, with survivorsupport.net, and my weekly live program, Journey to Healing, which can be heard on tecntv.com, Friday nights, 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for purposes of producing the Predator Watch podcast, I draw upon my 11 plus years of intensive clinical work on psychology staff within the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. I was recruited to create what would be the nation's first intensive treatment program to men in long-term solitary confinement. It was there that I accrued over the course of time, both in the long-term solitary program and then in general population solitary, more clinical contact hours in that environment than any other psychology staff member in the US or Canada. I was trained by Dr. Robert Hare, who was flown out by the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections to provide specialized training to a small group of us toward forensic certification in the PCLR, their psychopathy checklist. I was then afforded the opportunity to oversee the clinical treatment in one of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections specialized forensic sex offender treatment units, a 65-bed program for high-risk and sexually violent predators and pedophiles. I also conducted high and low-intensity sex offender treatment groups within the general prison population. I've written hundreds of prison psych evals and reviewed and assessed the level of risk for hundreds of sex offenders, along with serving in other clinical capacities within the prison system, including drug and alcohol treatment and the institution's specialized unit for mental health inmates.
A listener asked Jon the age-old question regarding whether psychopaths are born that way or do they come to learn how to prey on others?
Okay, excellent question. They learn it with experience. Okay, so as they go down, and that brings us right back to where we left off last time. So as someone goes down the slippery slope, they are getting worse. They are morphing into, as a matter of fact, you'll remember this picture, the numbers are upside down just for visual effect. So the worse somebody goes, right at the end of the fog they go, that's where psychopathy is. Prior to that is sociopathy, and then you have narcissism, and we looked at narcissism. A simple narcissist, of course, as we've talked about before, they love their reflection, as it were. That's self-aggrandizing, but that's a simple one. So a malignant narcissist is one that is just not satisfied because they're becoming deviant. Now, we think of deviant in terms of sexually deviant, but deviance and the reprobate mind, that process is the same. So I'm beginning to objectify people on an ever-increasing basis. That's the reprobate mind. That's that twisting effect. I think we're surrounded by them. Why? Because we're surrounded by people that have given themselves permission to do them, so to speak, to become increasingly selfish. Once you do that, then anything is possible. And then choose whatever your fancy is. Wine, women, and song, money, sex, and power, whatever it is. Oftentimes there's going to be sex and sexuality involved. But a sexual psychopath, there's a difference between bloody psychopath and white-collar psychopath. Bloody psychopath is the one that tends to come to our minds when we think of psychopath, like the Alfred Hitchcock killer or Freddy Krueger and those horrible movies. Okay, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about people who nobody suspected. Where do you find them? We talked about it before. You find them in politics. You find them in finance, you find them in psychology, you find them in law enforcement, you find them in medicine, you find them everywhere. They tend to be the most ingratiating. They understand impression management. So that is the classic white-collar psychopath. He can turn it on, turn it off at will. So thinking in terms of a sex offender then, and then somebody who's harmed a child, and somebody who has been perpetrating for years. This is someone without a conscience.
So that was Jon's psychological education on psychopathy. Now we'll explore Jon's spiritual warfare perspective on psychopathy. Notice how the scriptural concept of being given over to a reprobate mind is what Jon refers to as going through the twisting effect, and what I refer to as undergoing revolution.
It's a slippery slope. If we get off the straight and narrow, we will start a stair-step fashion, or stair-step-like fashion process downward. It builds like a snowball that picks up speed. The further you go down, there is a twisting effect. See under my picture where it says twisting effect and moral inversion. It's very real, and that's the process of Romans chapter 1 being given over to a reprobate mind. The reprobate, as we've talked about in the past, means it's not good for its original use or purpose, its intended purpose. Okay, so with respect to our mind, that's different than our brain. Our brain has gray matter and white matter. So our mind has to do with personality and our soul. So if somebody's mind is given over to selfishness, there's a progression that happens, and someone can reach a point that they go beyond the point of no return. As the book of Romans talks about, they're given over. So you can reach a point beyond which you're ever going to come back. And here's the reason why. Because you lose as a divine judgment. The further somebody goes into selfishness, you're becoming blind, you're becoming deaf, you're reinterpreting what he's doing. He's trying to get your attention, he's knocking on your door, but eventually, because you're turning away so much, it's not just that you're turning away and you're turning away from the door. Things are happening on the inside of you, including your mind and your heart and your soul are becoming callous, they're becoming cauterized, because nobody is static. You're either getting better or worse, better or bitter, and you're becoming a different person, and you're starting to have your ego, your selfishness grow.
In conclusion, there are 3 key takeaway points from this episode. Number 1, revolution exploits humankind's tendency towards self-gratification and self-glorification. Number 2, revolution is the beginning, the progression, and the end result of the demoralization process. Number 3, the demoralized have a broken conscience. They can no longer properly self-evaluate. These discussions are a companion to my book entitled Revolution, an Introduction to the Art and Science of Worldview Warfare. It cites numerous psychological and theological studies on revolution. Thanks for your time. This concludes the intermediate level discussion of the revolutionary component of my Worldview Warfighting Architecture. But there is also a counter-revolutionary component, so please stay tuned for future discussions.